to see you all and welcome here at the book launch of the book of colleague Aslam Fataar. I should say welcome here at the Faculty of Theology, but also here at the Beyer Naude Centre for Public Theology. I say this for a particular reason because, Aslam, if I'm correct, this is the second book in a sense that we have launched and here at the Beyer Naude Centre for Public Theology, so for us it's very exciting that we can continue this journey. I can also announce, because it's only recently been accepted, that Aslam has also been Professor Fataar nominated, elected to be part of the board of the Beyer Naude Centre for Public Theology. And we are looking forward to some more engagements. There are some exciting projects that's in the pipeline that we've been working also with a colleague, Simon, there with the work that he's been doing in terms of interreligious dialogue and encounters. So a warm welcome to everyone here. It's good to have you all here, and I think it's important, the space, but then also our presence, the fact that we are here to have this kind of engagement. So everyone, a warm welcome to you. And then to the man of the moment, Professor Fataar, also welcome to you. And again, congratulations on this latest publication. You might know Professor Fataar, he hasn't, hy sit nog nie stil nie, daar's heeltyd nuwe werk wat gedoen word, new work that comes out, and so on, engaging different questions, but also engaging reality as a what I can call also an engaged theologian, you're educationist, but also as an engaged theologian. So we are looking forward to the conversation this afternoon, and also how that will also stimulate more collaborations.
Thank you very much.
So, without further ado, I'm going to give over to you. You will do a brief introduction, share a bit about the publication, and then Professor Simon, he will come to the front.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Noel, Professor Simon, Beyer Naude Centre, Faculty of Theology, all of you who are here. Special acknowledgement to Awqaf South Africa, who has published this book, spent good money on publishing it. They are part of an Islamic civilizational project all over the place, and they do development work, maths workshops, and AI and technology workshops, and so on and so forth, as part of their development work. Beyer Naude Centre, who published my previous book 6 years ago, and all of you, thank you very much for attending. I just want to make a couple of remarks. I think you've got it in front of you, but let me just try to go to follow it a little bit. I will be ad-libbing as I continue, but let me just first say that, of course, this book is a personal piece of writing, consisting of a number of essays that I've written over the last 3 or 4 years. And so it's basically my attempt to witness, or to give witness, to particular moments as they unfold in real time. And it is a kind of an attempt to make sense of the layered crises that we're in by a combination of theological normative assumptions. In other words, I think theology should do this, as well as some sociological analysis embedded, because I am a sociologist of education. And so there's some analysis embedded in the book, in the text as well as some imaginative application of religious theological tools to speak into the moment and make sense of that moment, and to give it some kind of meaning and some kind of intent, theological intent. I think that all people, particularly religious people, do this in any, committed religious people do this in any case. They stand on a particular moment. They are infused by certain assumptions about life and certain normative projections about that life. and they give expression to that in their thinking, in their writing, and in their practice. I think in the theological space, we do that all the time. In my case, I write it down, and often the writings are at the invitation of newspapers, of organizations, of community-based initiatives that asks me from time to time to come and say something, right? And that is the outlet, the venue for me to what everyone else does, to just put it on table. And what I've done across kind of 30 years, and I'm really not that old, but old enough, I have persuaded myself that when I speak to community fora, I need to think carefully about that, and I need to write it down. And there's a certain kind of payoff in that, because now you actually have a text. And just say something about the cover. This cover was going to look much different and very busy, because I was trying to put 4 pictures in a quadrant on the cover that captures an aspect of my identity. And the core aspect is going to be a mosque and a church in thrown down District 6. So it was a kind of a collage of 4 pictures where that image came from. And it was very important for me to have the mosque and the church in there, because I wanted to show that is the discursive influences that formed my life in a context of the 1970s of the forced removals and actually the throwing. But I presented the collage, I presented the collage to my cover designer, and he said, it doesn't work, because it detracts from what you're trying to communicate. So this is a picture that I took in May 2024, a year ago, and it is a mosque in Jakarta, Indonesia, to which transoceanically all of us probably have connections to. Most of us probably have connections to. I mean, let's not doubt that for a minute, right? But the architecture of the Freedom Day Mosque, 1955. Indonesia got their independence from Holland, and that was the mosque that was built. And I love the aesthetics and the architecture, because I make an argument for this book about aesthetics. Aesthetics is that 1 minute before thinking or before thought. And I think, this is the argument of the book. If it's not made explicit here, that Islamic and religious ethics, and I try my best when I speak about Islamic ethics to be inclusive of other religious traditions. So let me say, religious ethics or secular ethics, in moments of complexity, find their expression in aesthetics, 1 moment before thought. And when we move that aesthetics up to thought, that's where the problem lies. Because then our prior dogmas get in the way. And I'm suggesting we've got to honor the aesthetics. And I've got to say that we are in the aesthetical moment. Now, aesthetic doesn't just mean beauty. I have the title beauty in here. Aesthetics means how the world presents itself to us in its multi-dimensional ugliness and beauty and expression. So aesthetics is simply expression. It's a wonderful word for it in the religious discourse. It's called Jamal. The ethics of articulated notions of what it means to be beautiful. That's the word Jamal. So some people give the kids the name Jamil after that word. And so it's a tall order to have that name, by the way. Right. So that is the personal part of it. These essays are therefore real time. So 1 moment after aesthetics, I try to say something, right? So it's real time. So what my methodology is, and here's the sociologist, Simon, is that I try to say, okay, we're living in this particular aesthetical moment, but if I apply a sociological language to it, or philosophical language to it, what do I understand? And here, I apply a kind of a grounded methodology. I try my hardest to listen to the ground speaking, metaphorically speaking, to say, what is the complexity of the contextual realities that we're finding ourselves into? And then to try to a language that speaks into that and provides sets of descriptions for that language before we can project normatively about what we ought to do. So there's a a dialectical relationship between sociological understanding and the complexity of that. We're living in complex times, AI-driven times, and so on. And sociology is almost like moribund. It can't capture the complexity, right? So how do we theologize if we can't capture the complexity, right? So I start with that impossibility. Sociology Our sociological categories have to be shifted in order to understand the realities. But the starting point for that shift is to kind of put your ear to the ground. It relates somewhat to my own sociological training as a critical ethnographer who lived for an entire year in a township. Lived as a bit of I spent from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the township and then went home for an entire year. That is on a sabbatical in 2004. And that is what I mean by let the ground speak and so on. So I wrote a book on that as well. It's a 2015 book on let the ground speak in relation to schooling, in particular competency-based environments. So that stays with me, right? These kind of frames, they stay with me. What the book does, therefore, is to develop a kind of a process theology of response. Practical theology, a process theology of response. And a process theology, in my mind, is that the divine within us is an enfolding divine. It enfolds one, it captures one, but it's an unfolding divine. It is not a static, dogmatic God. It is not a static presence that preaches to us what to do. But the divine within us, or let me use this language, the spirit within us, moves us towards the understanding, and the understanding of that contextual reality impacts on the way the divine works within us. In that sense, it is dynamic. It is Marxist dialectical. Why Marxist? Because some of my theoretical frames out of the 80s and 90s struggle times come out of that I can't deny who I am. So the dialectic between the divine and the context is ever formative. So how does that work, for example, in an example of a poem that I start with? The poem is by Rifat Al-Arir. Everyone have encountered this poem in December 2023 in the first page. He's a Palestinian. He releases this poem one day before he dies. One day before he's bombed to death, and 3 generations of his family is bombed with him. All his children, mother, father, uncles, brothers, grandparents, all of them killed in one bomb. But he releases a poem one day before his death, and the poem is devastating. Whenever I think about it, I kind of I'm a little bit overcome. The poem is If I Must Die. By the way, he died tomorrow. That was his predestination. If I must die, you must live to tell my story. And the poem goes on about what he means about that. So, in death, living a life of a deathly life, what Achille Mbembe calls necropolitical life, life as if dead. He affirms life. He affirms life. So how do our theological responses speak to that? And then suddenly you go to the text, the religious text. And suddenly you see in the religious text that you've never seen before. And that is how your religious texts affirm that very point. In life, in death, there is the emergence of life. And so you find that, and that becomes part of the way you are framed, you frame going forward, post October 2023, or December 2023. And the point here is to say is that the colonial modernity by which we've lived our life over the last 400 years have a particular conception of death, or it has no conception of death. Because it's based on the kind of modern linear logic that life is about progress ad infinitum until at some point you fall off the cliff of the civilization. Modernity has no conception of where progress stops. And therefore, we are in developmental terms, decolonially posited, we are in developmental terms in the planetary sustainability crisis that we are. That's one of the consequences of it. What this man, Rifat Al-Ari, tells, he was a professor of literature, by the way, and he lectured in English because he was saying that he needed to tell the Palestinian struggle in English. What he's saying to us is that you've got to bring death back into the picture. In other words, you've got to bring accountability back into the picture. That things will come to an end. There will be accountability. There will not be impunity, and so on and so forth. Or at least in my process theology, that is how I made sense of this particular moment. So in that sense, I think in some or other way, whether we like it or not, whether we are on the one side or on the other side or not, we've lived in this necropolitical discursive reality of watching a genocide unfolding through our machines, and so on and so forth. And it positioned all of us to ask that question, how do we relate to death? So that is, in a sense, that is an example of the way this process theology works for me. And so the text traverses multiple forms, as I've said: sermons, reflective essays, sociological commentary, collaborative writing. It focuses on many topics. It advances a key concept. This is the one Arabic concept that maybe you should take note of here. A concept called adab al-ihsan. It means behavioral ethics. But it's ethics, it's etiquette, and it's aesthetics. Often in my religious theological tradition, only the ethic parts gets mentioned. Why? Because over the unfolding 14,000 years of theological tradition and the way in which power work within this tradition, it's only the political part and the rules part that gets emphasized. But in this tradition sits a deep aesthetical tradition that has been suppressed by the way in which the discourse has been held up throughout the centuries. But it's there, it's there right there. It's right there in blind sight in front of you. Right? So if we ask this particular question, the excavation of this aesthetical tradition, or the etiquette tradition, or the behavioral tradition, because it's right there in front of you, it's available to you to mobilize. So you can very well understand that what I'm arguing goes against the dominant religious grain in my community. It goes against it because this is not emphasized. And it's not Sufi mysticism. It is part of that. But it's actually an etiquette behavioral tradition that encounters the world in the fullness of its complexity and establishes yourself as a participant in the world on a basis of a certain normative concept. That is what it is. It is also the mystical, it's also the spiritual, and so on and so forth. So it allows us to kind of think to the kind of the transoceanic meted localization and the indigenization moment in the 17th century, founding of this particular space, these particular spaces all over here. This kind of mystical tradition was at play in the indigenous community, in the transoceanic communities that came from Africa and India and West and East Africa. That is, in the pre-Enlightenment sense, what these communities brought to the table. That is the colonial traditions that they put to work. They invented languages, they invented literacies, they invented Afrikaans, by the way. They invented, etc., etc. They invented forms of agency that allowed them to encounter this particular world in a particular way as dominated colonial subjects. That is the tradition that I drew on. It is not a particular tradition that I am rooted within the Islamic tradition in this sense, but it's the methodology of the tradition that I draw on here, and that is localization, stories, literacies, reworked within the context of one's life that draws fundamentally on the resources of those communities, ontological, theological, epistemological, and resources of that particular moment. By planetary times, I'll stop in 2 minutes. By planetary times, I propose a theological reorientation. I'm arguing that colonial modern discourse is not going to help us here, and for reasons that you probably all know: the separation between head and heart, the preference for rational thought, the preference for models of progress that is going to take us off the edge, and so on and so forth. But what I'm arguing for here is that we have to move beyond the destructive egoism of modern human-centeredness, that the human being truly is at the center of the world, of the planet, of the universe. That is the modernist conceit, and it's not. We've got to decenter that. A process theology acknowledges an interdependent ecology of humans and non-humans, animate and inanimate, in relational attunement with the crises that we're currently finding ourselves. I can say much more. I'm going to just scan my eyes through what I could potentially say. The last thing that I want to say is that I want to have you cast your eyes to the last 2 or 3 paragraphs. It says that I would like, my work for myself returns me back to this notion of the good life. What I incorrectly, my wife read it this morning, I asked her, did I really say the good life? Because I meant to say something else. I meant it to say the convivial life. There's a big difference between the good life and the convivial life. The convivial life is a life of joy, of laughter, of expression, of being being free in one's ability to kind of speak back to the world in spite of the change that we're under. So it's in Arabic hayat and tayban, the good lives. So even that translational switch there from the good life to the convivial life, that might be contested by linguists in my community, but that's the way you play with language. So it is as a life lived with intensity and intentiveness and moral clarity, which critiques the false promise of progress that erases death, even as death is enacted through genocide and poverty and so on. So this book affirms death, that death is not an end, which it obviously is. Mortal death is an end, but it's actually the seed of life. And my argument is that we have to read our religious theological tradition in that way, right? And that ultimately, for me, the ultimate ethical and strategic issue and aesthetical issue is that the book calls for solidarity across divides, big and small. That is what it calls for, right? It urges us to move beyond the self, to move beyond our religious traditions, to forge friendships across difference, rooted in humility, justice, and ethical repair. There's a verse in the Quran that says, if you are confronted with the enemy at its worst, then you have to encounter him as if he could be your bosom friend. My goodness, what a challenge. Waliyun Hamim. That the man or the person, the human being, this modernist machinery encounters you and reconstitutes you, and you speak back to that in these odious kinds of ways. And this ethical tradition tells you, see him potentially as your bosom friend. Waliyun Hamim. So that is for me, probably in strategic terms, in solidarity terms, the most important framer of who I am. I refuse to see how difference can divide us. Thank you very much.
But I think you've set the scene for us, I think in a very profound way. Thank you for that. Also for who you are, your person.
Thank you.
In terms of opening yourself up for this kind of engagement. I really appreciate that. Colleagues, we have Professor Xolile Simon here with us, who will also make a few comments in terms of responding, but also in terms of reading. Professor Simon, you might know personally, he's been involved on our various points on our campus in terms of engaging interreligious dialogue, interreligious encounter, growing more sensitivity in terms of intercultural issues. He's a professor here in what we call missiology or intercultural theology in some contexts, and also leading our MPhil program in religion and culture. and we are also scheming some plans. Over the last 3 years, he's been directing a program called Abraham Goes Global, where they've exposed our various student communities from South Africa, Finland, etc., to various religious traditions. So we are looking forward, Professor Simon, to your input this morning, this afternoon. So over to you.
Colleagues, I need to put on my clock here for my 10 minutes. From my side, I also want to say good afternoon, and also thank you for Professor Fataar and the organizers to invite me to give a response. So therefore, I greet all my colleagues in the faculty, but also my colleagues here from student communities. Those are the two spaces where I interact around this question in the class, but also outside the class. So I'm accepting, and I've accepted the invitation and also the call to participate in cultivating an ethics of beauty and excellence in planetary times. And I'm also somebody who likes to put my feet on the ground in terms of running so that I can feel also the elements, the physical elements, the nature And that order for me is important in my own reflective mode. I'll come back and say something about that later on. So what I will do, I'll briefly say something about the first part of the book, the introduction, the middle part and the last part, maybe in 5-6 minutes. And therefore, I will also go into my reflective mode. Professor Fataar, I think the first time we met was a couple of years back. We had an interfaith, interreligious conference of our society in the faculty here. And for about 5-6 years, both of us were guest lecturers in the faculties of humanity. So that actually forces me to think between what I called interfaith theology. That means any discipline that focuses on the question that we discuss here is an interfaith discipline. So that is where we met and so. So therefore, this is also a kind of a personal reflection. As I said, I go into the reflective mode, that actually I speak with the I, my own agency. But sometimes I also need to objectify myself. You, Xolile, how do you address these issues and how do they affect you, as you, the me, has also over many years experienced directly or indirectly the challenges and the crisis that you address in this book. Now let me start then briefly with the introduction and the first part of the book. You are correct, I agree. The approach itself, it's a grounded approach with your feet on the ground, with your hands. Because through that you pick up all the experiences and the stories and the narratives that trigger your thinking in terms of how you write, how you teach, and how you do a research. So the first part introduced then the approach here, but there are 3 central aspects that come to the fore here that keeps this together. We've already heard about the ethics of beauty and excellence. That's the first one. But the other one is got a specific intention and outcome, and that is to nurture and to cultivate this excellence that is actually already embodied in our nature. So the potential, it is there. The talent is there in our bodies, around in nature, but it just needs to be activated. So that's the second one that's coming in there. The third one, which I really appreciate and enjoy, is to draw from the text, the Quran, is to draw from tradition, the Sunnah, is to draw from the kind of scholarship. That is primary. So that is also what I see there. But what I also like, and I'll come back to this later, is around chapter 14 and 15, as an example how what you call the groundedness has been expressed. And that has to do with the Hajj pilgrimage. Your own story around it, your own narrative around it, it's so deep in terms of personal experience, but also in terms of what can be activated and cultivated by that journey. And so I say I'll come back later to that also. So that is what I pick up in terms of the introduction and the first couple of chapters. Thereafter, I will just refer to some of the contents and the theme of the chapters, just to see how this actually flows together as the chapters have been written over a period of 6 years. Now from chapter 2, chapter 3, 8 and 13, there you actually see the weaving together of these notions of the beauty and the excellence in terms of particular context. As you say, you write as you listen and engage. And part of that context, also the beauty chapter 3, is a sense of active listening, is listening with the heart, is the pathos, is the passion to which you are actually referring to. It's not something secondary, something that we cut and paste from books. It actually is activated from the ground and so. So chapter 3 already picking up that passion and compassion in the context of femicide, in the context of GBV, in the context of epidemics like COVID. So those become important, the context. That's what I pick up from chapter 2, 3, 8, and 13. Then comes chapter somewhere in the middle, 14 and 15, and this is where the methodology is actually also concretely illustrated. If I don't have time to come back to it, let me rather say it here now. You know, you've invited me and say call, and I've responded. I also invite you. I also call you. What you've written here to demonstrate, as you say, with a couple of colleagues inside the classroom, but also outside the classroom. When I read, I immediately realized when I introduced Islam to my second-year students, that's why sometimes I do the touch myself, because it's the only space where you can actually do what you teach is in the touch. It's like a workshop. So therefore, I usually prescribe just one second years, one text of 20 pages. But then there are other texts where you have to work now in terms of the heart and the head, the pathos and the logos. This is the kind of work that actually opens that up. Because in chapter 14, you are actually saying, you know what, I'm going on to this journey. And this is a personal journey. And the way that you weave in your personal aspect in the tradition is just so beautiful that I've seen there. That is like chapter 4. But then in chapter 15, you come out and now you're in the reflexive mode. So just imagine you can actually design that for cultivation in the space of the text. You give students, say, you just read that part, chapter 4. Then you reflect on it. How do you feel about it? What is happening? And then invite the author and then put in now chapter 15. So I say, I've heeded your call, but I also invite you to journey with me together that also. So that's very, very beautiful as far as this is concerned. Now, the other chapters then go into specific realities, specific orders. I said earlier, I like to be on the feet physically when I'm running. So that's the physical order. That's the natural order of the planet. Chapter 19 to 22, and some of them also focus more now on the social order. And those chapters, let me say, it's not just the social order, but it's also the spiritual order. For example, chapter 19 to 22 is the mercy and forgiveness of Allah, who's an active agent, who actually condition the content of the resources that we read, but it also condition our fellow pilgrims when they go through Ramadan. So beautiful chapter that already. And chapter 20 is the ethics of servitude, also in terms of encountering the divine in the context of vulnerability and vulnerable groups and so. And it continues to Palestine, solidarity, and also the trauma that we experience. Now, that would be the relational dimension in the social and the spiritual order. But there's also the institutional dimension of the social and the spiritual order in higher education. And therefore, chapter 24, 26, 28, 29, and others pick up really the question of the assault on the educators in Palestine, scholasticide. But it also the role of higher education in facilitating democratic questions, even in the context of intercultural and interfaith dialogue. So, two dimensions in the social order, and that is the relational one, but also the institutional one. This is how I actually read that chapter, because this was an invitation for me, not just to accept, but also to respond. So I must do something with the content of this book. That's how I read it like this and so. Now, in the last 5 minutes then, let me go now into my reflective mode. Because when you do transdisciplinary research, and by the way, I actually pick it up myself. I'm not a sociologist, but over the years I thought, you know what, I need to pick up a discipline that's gonna help me to be grounded, but also help me to activate the theology that is in me and so. So the second part is briefly about this. You know what, how will I then respond to your call from within my disciplines, in the classroom, but also where I'm located in student communities where a lot of these things are actually happening around me. So there is my feet and my ears and my hands on the ground. But how will I respond? And I must say, over the years, I've seen what you do. I've seen the students you supervise, and I've looked at what framework they use and so. And then I realized there's something common between the two of us, is the work of Margaret Archer as a critical realist sociologist. And these are actually, when I read this, and your ontology, I was busy with this already, you know. But the last one, a couple of days, it's been human, the problem of agency. Because you read it to design for change and cultivate deeply as far as students are concerned. So therefore, when I put on my own reflective lens, I go into Archer and read also what you say in relation to what she is writing. Your own general concerns, but also your ultimate concerns. I can hear your voice in here. I can hear your experience. I pick up the stories. So our really general concerns and ultimate concerns about the physical order, about the practical order, and about the social order. This is what I pick up from Archer and so. Those are important because they are, as she says, they are kind of emotive commentaries on our life. That is where the emotive part come in. That's where the pathos come in and so. So I like that. So I also read yours from that perspective and so. So therefore, if I would summarize the chapters that I've referred to, I would say these are commentaries from the heart, pathos, the emotive dimension, expressed with passion and beauty and excellence. But at the same time, the engagements with the head and the logos. And the head and the logos can only interact so beautifully and passionately because you've been an engaged scholar on the ground and so, as you say, in the Cape Flats and other places and so. So that is what I really pick up there. So therefore, then in my own reflection, then when I need to go and reread this chapter, from the perspective of general concern, but the ultimate concern as your project with the divine, I need to reread it from that kind of perspective also. In each of the three orders, for example, the physical order, the concern that you have about ecology, the emotive part, the anger, all those things is part of this also. Then, as I said also, when you go on the heart, it's also the beauty of the place, the nature in there. It's part of that emotive part. And obviously, you know, there are some dimensions that are challenging. So there is where the emotive part becomes central in this discussions and so on. Another illustration is obviously why you say engaging in this kind of context is the context of solidarity, in the context of anger, in the context of difficulty. What keeps us hopefully is the beauty of solidarity that actually also comes in there. So therefore, the emotional dimension, like anger, like courage, is related to somebody's concern. At the end of the day, to conclude now with the work that you do, then the big question becomes how we activate our intercultural and interfaith agency so that the structural elements and the cultural elements that avoid what we want to be are changed so that we can contribute to the change that we want to see. So it's the activation of our agency around our general concerns, around our ultimate concerns, which also include the emotive part that will actually facilitate the good that we may see in structures, but also the good that we may see in the cultures, and hopefully lessen all the aspects that are not good. So this is the way that I read your way, from the perspective of the narrative and so. So in conclusion, chapter 14 and 15, I invite you somewhere in August and June that we develop something around 2 thoughts, and we let students go through it, but we also measure pedagogically and see if the cultivation has taken place or not, even within 3 or 4 sessions, according to the propositions that comes from Archer's cycle and others around it also. So colleagues, thank you very much for the Nkosi Siyabulela.
Yeah.
For a wonderful engagement. Before we open up the conversation to comments or questions, I just want to make 3 comments, if I may. I feel a bit emotional because, you know, it was, Aslam, literally a week ago when I was in Jakarta at this.
Oh my word! My goodness! Wow.
And what struck me and still lingers in terms of the experience, the encounter,
Sure.
you know, in the mosque was 3 things that
Wow.
you know that you know remains and that lingers. And like you said, the beauty, the architectural beauty of the mosque, the dome, but the interesting thing is that apparently the architect who developed this mosque is a Protestant
Yes.
Christian
Yes.
from Indonesia.
How interesting is that?
That's really profound. And what I've also experienced in terms of Islam in Indonesia is this kind of conviviality that you referred to.
Yes, very much so.
The second experience while we were there was also, you know, the inclusive nature of, you know, the people that gathered there, families sitting there, you know, it was amazing. Families sitting there in little circles, children, grandparents, different generations, husband and wives, you know, it is really a place, yes, worship, but also of fellowship, of being together, you know, just sharing meals there, people sitting there, you know, on the ground, and then thirdly also, you know, the absolute friendliness, you know, the welcoming.
Indonesians.
I was amazed. I was overwhelmed, I should say, almost by the welcoming atmosphere in that. So that's the first thing when you refer to this. But I also, as I was reading, and Cornelia already mentioned that, you know, the different modes in which we do theology.
Yeah.
Essays, sermons, it is public, you know, comments, commentary, but then also, you know, engaging in public media. How do we engage in public media where theology, you know, makes that impact? That's also, I think, profound. And we will see, you know, the mode, the genre. It's not one particular genre. It's different genres, and different ways, modes of doing theology. Yesterday we had another book launch of Turkey Smith, and he was making the same point.
Wow.
His theology emerged from specific invitations, specific you know, moments where he reflects on key issues. And you know, this is the kind of theology that we also see embodied here. So I just wanted to make those few comments, you know, and really want to appreciate the moment and the connection.
Yeah.
I never thought, you know, that what I experienced last week before, and you know, that it would come together in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
So this is just I believe it works in the spiritual realm. So colleagues, let's have some conversations. Any comments, any responses, any questions that you want to share also in this moment with Aslam, perhaps with the group and so on. Perhaps you want to ask a question or just make a comment. Feel free.
And also through your address. I was just thinking, you in one of the paragraphs you mentioned certain religious concepts about time and deep time and prostration and so on. And we also recently had a conference here about one of the old Christian creeds, and notions like deep time came also, was part of the discussions. What does it mean to live and talk and also living together, given such an understanding of time. So I would like to read, of course, more in the book, but maybe if you want to respond to that, that would be much appreciated.
Thank you, Amit. I certainly will. Firstly, to say to Kolele, I'm sort of a bit nervous to speak back to what you were saying, because that was such a profound thing. But we'll have many moments to talk about that. But your morphogenesis is kind of point on point, and you may just want to look in Joy's direction, because she's just been grappling with for her thesis work. That Joy Peterson thing. So yes, so we are in academia and we're alive and well with our theoretical conceptions. Again, the interesting thing is that you think you know your texts, but when you are moved by the world that you live in and the complexity of that world, as that world encounters you and as you encounter that world. So let me say, interestingly, that the 2015 decolonial moment completely ruptured my modernist, post-structuralist understandings of the world. I mean, theoretically, I lived by Foucault, Stephen Ball, Henri Lefebvre, who is a spatial theorist of the everyday that is just kind of profoundly allowed. I lived by those kinds of concepts, Kaufman, and so on and so forth. And I remember writing with fellow Australians arguments speaking back to Nancy Fraser's trilateral conception of social justice and kind of expanding it in a modernist frame in 2015. And then the decolonial struggle happened, and I looked at myself in relation to that analysis, and I thought, but it's so trapped within a genealogy that only takes us this far. That is a way to answer the question. And then you read your texts on that modernist basis. You are in essence trapped by that, the way in which you read those texts. But when you are confronted with the broader pluriversal multi-ecologies, multi-knowledge ecologies world that's available to you, you understand you have to do a much more capacious, a much wider, a much more generous reading, without undermining your modernist concepts, but now establishing a different conversation with those concepts. So I love the way in which Edward Said invites us into worldliness readings through the contrapuntal, and his arguments that you play the piano this way, but you can also play the piano that way, and you get different kind of overlaying, and to some people it would sound like a noise, but that's exactly the point, because you're unsettling yourself. And so you approach your text, and you see that there are various conceptions of time in the text. And they are aligned with each other, but they are also, so they are quotidian time, everyday time by which you organize your rhythms, and you understand in the foundational religious Islamic moment that quotidian time was completely reorganized from the particular corrosive 7th century Arabian context that was confronted that moment, the prophethood at that moment. And that space reorganized time literally everyday time to operate in a different way, to undermine the way in which the discursive structures and the meaning-making structures and the power structures were operating on particular notions of fatalistic time. And it introduces various notions of time. But basically what it says is that it introduces divine time, which is accountability, in conversation with quotidian time, rearranging that entirely. And that is the notion, that complex notion of deep lived time, not clock time. Clock time is modern time, that then goes out into a legacy that establishes a civilization over at least 5 centuries, called the golden era of this particular legacy, in which architecture, art and design and aesthetics and science and once the in the so-called Dark Ages, pre the Enlightenment, ruled the world and seeded the Enlightenment on the basis of that time. And then colonial modernity happens and it ruptures that and it hides that from view. So the decolonial colonial moment kind of engages me in a particular way. I am located now differently. I'm still Aslam, but I'm now located differently. I've now become more and more different. So, and then I read and I discover how to mobilize notions of life, notions of time, notions of death, in ways that is much deeper than what we used to, out of which emerge that particular understanding of life, of time, of destiny, of accountability, and so on and so forth. Long story short, that it's also, the spur for me was fundamentally student struggle. Open Stellenbosch, fees must fall. That was what it was, to be very honest.
Are there any other comments or questions, responses? One of the things, Aslam, that I think you also referred to, that it came out strongly in the book, is your consciousness of the times we are living in. Yeah. We call it reading the signs of the times, you know, the vulnerability, you referred to that a number of times, the crisis, the pandemic, AI, but then also the genocide, you know, in Gaza. Vulnerabilities that in a sense shake us, but then also just moments of truth that calls it, you know, you can't be neutral in that. Can you maybe say something about that?
Sure.
So that's a theme that also runs.
It runs, and by the way, over the last 4 months, Reggie, I was incapacitated with a procedure to my mouth, which is still ongoing. That's why I had to postpone it. So I had to be rushed to hospital to fix this because everything was taken out and false things were put in and so on, and it was giving me hectic problems, which impeded my ability to speak. In addition to then having to take pain tablets it was hectically painful to deal with a mouth that was under reconstruction. But it allowed, and I was under hectic, I don't know what it was, a cocaine-based tablets that I was taking. So I became addicted to the cocaine tablets. I generally did. But what it did, it induced a kind of state of creative activity. It's unbelievable. So you have hectic pain. Don't do this. You have hectic pain, and then you take these drugs, and then there's a kind of a creative, I wouldn't say stillness, it's never still, creative activation. And I wrote about in a particular moment another 30 essays in this 4 months. It was right there. But it was much more sociological because of wanting to make sense of the world that we're living in. And Gaza became for me not the beginning and end all of colonial erasure, literally, but it became the symbol and the material context in which the entire world is living its life. And so the big question that I ask myself is, how do I behave ethically, but also how do I behave strategically? So I think that ethics asks you to stand for justice with clarity, but ethics also asks you to behave politically within the context in which you are, because the surrounding world and the politics in that world does not align with your ethics. So immediately you have to say, okay, now how do you present yourself so that you can develop a conversation about that and so on. But it's not a conversation where you are where you are driven by the tactical in the first instance. So you compromise and say, but you are fundamentally positioned ethically. And then the tactical question becomes about how you develop a language of calling people in. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. But the second point was about vulnerability. So I've also come to understand through the Gaza moment, through the genocide moment, that decoloniality is framed fundamentally by trauma. And this trauma sits in our bodies. It's 500 years of trauma. And it's unresolved. And it is recycled. And we haven't interrupted it. And we haven't developed an ethical language in order to have a conversation that re-narrates that trauma into something palpably more productive. So we sit, it's like this trauma is animatedly suspended in a corner that's watching us, and that's impacting how we re-traumatize ourselves. And the metaphor that I use for this trauma is the death of Shaheed Martyr Imam Abdullah Harun in 1969 on the 25th of September. And the inquest that happens in 2018, right, into his death. And how my family, my wife and her family were directly related to Imam Harun, how that it happened. So the inquest happens 50 years ago, but it is as if, because we went to the inquest, it's as if you relive that trauma as if you were in the 1969 moment. So it is trauma being reproduced over and over and over and over because our societal structures of order, the social structures that Kolide is speaking about, is not arranged in such a way, particularly the material basis of our lives, is not arranged in such a way that we can interrupt that trauma and to allow us the capacity to move through it. Not to deny it, but move through it and work through that much more productively, right? And then you reread your text and you see to yourself, but why out of this body corpus, what you call the tradition, the Sunnah tradition of the Prophet, the sayings and doings of the Prophet, when you are alert to it, out jumps out of this text of a body corpus of maybe about 100,000 sayings of the Prophet. What jumps out is the context of vulnerability that he and religion was born in. All religion. This is an example of one religion. And at one point he says, in something that we all know and we grow up with, he says, he makes a prayer. Prophet Muhammad makes a prayer to God and he asks God, let me live amongst the vulnerable. Let me die amongst the vulnerable. And let me be resurrected amongst the vulnerable. Suddenly, in relation to vulnerability and trauma. And then you also, it's just so powerful. Then one of the founding fathers of this particular community who arrived here in 1718 was put into change in Robben Island. He spent 10 years there and was rearrested in 1990, and then he came out in 1790, and then 1794 he established institution. This man is called Tuan Guru. You may have heard of him. He writes when he arrives in 1980, because he's a very learned person who he writes that this place, this colonial place, quote unquote, is what is called the Darul Huzn and a Darul La'an. It is a place of sorrow, trauma, recycling of that trauma. He established institutions to kind of interrupt that, right? And so vulnerability. But why am I reading this? I'm reading this because of Gaza. Because you're staring at your screen. You see how people are dying, decapitated and died. 14,000 kids are about to die because of hunger. That is what the UN is telling us. That impacts you. And it forces you to account for yourself and to read and to develop readings like that. I do know it's potentially just me, through my own resources that I read in my own positioning. And then that's the strategic question. But then the next question becomes, so I've written a couple of pieces to say, so what's the strategy? How do I sell this message? How do I propagate this message to people who are not located the way I am? So the answer to Koluli's question, and you and I, it's the social location of the particular dialogue, the person with whom you are dialogue, that is as important as his traumas, that's recycling, and as his normative commitments. So we've got to honor all of that. I think that is what it means, is that your worst enemy can become your best friend. You've got to honor that, you've got to understand it, you've got to encounter it, you've got to deal with it, you've got to establish the conversation out of those juxtapositions wherein lies what's in it. I think trauma locates us to adversarially. It immediately locates you adversarially. So you can't have the dialogue because you are enemies, because we don't see to each other's trauma. And I think an ethics of beauty forces you, how difficult that might be. I falter on the altar of this all the time, but it forces you to recognize, to make a much deeper recognition. And so I tell the story in the book of my mom, Silly, and their relationship with each other. I had two moms. I had Silly and my mom were moms, and they would compete as children with us about who were. So we had about 10 kids between the two moms, and they would compete about who the real mom was. And so that leaves us kind of very, very beautifully positioned in relation to the dialogue. So we all have that in our memory. Remember, but remember that this community was not ideologically or religiously defined in the 17th century. We brought all that all those ideas, all those religions together, and the definition only happened afterwards, particularly in the 18th century, vis-a-vis the way in which slavery worked here. And the division amongst our communities actually started emerging in the 18th century. But in the 17th century, these were survivalist, slave, indigenous communities come together. Got to go to that space. 18th century is the space of division. Got to know that space. But we've got to actually go to the century earlier, where we're actually just communities coexisting. Yeah, sorry for the long bayan. Thanks. Thanks.
So there's three last rounds of questions. So I'm going to start with Renee, you, and just three questions.
And then okay.
Thank you, Reggie. Always a pleasure listening to you and your brilliance. My question is around trauma, really. I am concerned that often the onus is on the traumatized to bear witness to the trauma, and not necessarily the bystanders to bear witness. Because if you think of the horrors that had happened in Gaza, the human rights violations, why would the onus be on the traumatized to try and position themselves to see their enemy as a bosom friend? So I'm concerned that our what is the word, lack of humanity really is still that of bystanders. Our positionality is very much an onlooker, looking at those that are traumatized to convince or to advocate for solidarity. That is a risk to our humanity and our shared humanity. The other question I want to just drop with you is that when the traumatized have gone through this horror and this genocide, you said you return to the text. Like, what did the text say about death and life? And I was wondering what the invitation was for the Christian community. Did the Christian community take up that invitation to return to their text, to look at what does the text say about human rights violations, about that level of abuse and genocide? And I think of the term for God, like when God reveals himself to, in the Old Testament, to Hagar and her son Ishmael, Muslim people, and reveals his name as Elroy, the God who sees.
Wow.
You know, my challenge is to the Christian community, have we really truly reflected on that text in the context of Gaza, to have the eyes of God who sees, Elroy?
Yeah.
And I think we might have missed that invitation.
Sure. So if I can just very quickly respond, and then I'm going to, and we can continue talking tomorrow afternoon. We have, maybe I should continue along this line tomorrow afternoon, but science and theology. Okay, right now. You see, your first question is the impossible question by which, it is the impossible question. The onus is on the victim. My goodness. So you want to deny that, right? And so I live I live in the reality of the limitation of that. I do. But the invitation is that you have to be open to the possibility that you could educate the reality. So within your traumatized body, about which you position as a victim through the structures and the personal relational oppressions that you yourself are a victim of, the invitation is to open up. How mad is that? Derrida calls that an aporia. It is a maddening aporia. But he also says, but you must do it. That is what Derrida says, right? He's a postmodernist philosopher. And I refuse that. But I have to. My ethical tradition tells me I have to. That is why you have to take your ethical tradition serious. You believe in God, right? Well, God is instructing you. But if you're lamsoni. Yes, man, life happened to you, man. But open yourself up. And you know what? Just in the way you landed on that last question about the God of Elroy, that's where the invitation opens up. So this conversation led to that idea. So Bismillah. Take it into your communities. Anyway.
The conversation continues tomorrow.
Yeah.
Got another question and the last question.
Thank you very much for that, passionate responses. The second page of your document, we also have conversation with you as we sort of going back to the office, and I'm also happy you said in passing that we've got to probably begin to speak about science and religion. And I think there is
that's for tomorrow.
Yes, no, not today, but I'm happy you said it. And, there's this paragraph of yours, the last 3 paragraphs, and of course you wrote this, but I would love to quote it and then proceed with the book is also a refusal. It refuses mechanized time, embodied modernity, and denying technology features. That's quite powerful, right? And you went on to say it insists that space and time are cyclical. Very powerful. And you concluded by saying each space and moment charged with divine significance. That's a very powerful statement. Personally, I tend to struggle with, especially when you said it insists that space and time are cyclical. Not just to Aslam himself, but both Christians and Muslims who are here, and that phase too, they can respond to that. My struggle, I struggle with this particular, argument personally, especially the part where you seem to clearly say that space and time seem to be sacred to you. I've had that view for a very long time, but having been confronted with the development of AI, and not just AI, the technologies that we have lately, and knowing pretty well that in the field of brain-computer interface, and further development of brain-computer interface, leading us to what we call lately the transhumanism, which eventually, being said, eventually, if it does happen, we are heading to singularity.
Singularity.
Of technology.
Yeah.
Now, my struggle with that part, and of course, this is becoming almost palpable. I just can't make sense of where I am as an individual. Whilst I would say I'm religious or spiritual, whatever way it is, but I foresee this development actually coming to being real. At the moment, we have certain advances where, or at least on paper, advances where the notion that we would one day download the mind and have it housed somewhere. So that in the future, when I'm not there, this mind is now being brought forth for us to be there in the next 50 years, whilst I'm there in the past 25 years. Now, my struggle is to bring this to exist in the world of knowing that space and time is sacred, simultaneously being confronted with the idea that I'm heading towards transhumanism. Simultaneously, I might even go beyond transhumanism, but get into singularity. How do I deal with these ideas?
Sure.
These are two extremes, which religion and science should be able to begin to confront.
Yeah. But just very quickly, I share the intensity of your comment, but I think coming from you as an AI scientist, it's a particularly deep comment, which I probably do not have the conceptual levers to fully understand. I read Yuval Harari on these things, right? Who makes the argument for singularity, that we are in that moment as well. Yuval Harari is a Jewish scholar, right? Again, there's a tradition that says wisdom is the lost property of people. Wherever you find it, whoever sells it, pick it up and make it your own, even if it comes from your enemy. In that sense, your enemy can be your best friend as well, right? This guy is actually supporting Zionists as well, Yuval Harari. So I've got 6 of his books here, and during the genocide, he mentioned that he's a supporting Zionist. What do? Right? I've got to take what he gives me. So he makes the argument for singularity. Again, you read. So, what is the religious response to the move towards singularity, transhumanism? It is the ethics, in my tradition, it is the ethics of how do I say that? So we've outsourced, algorithmic intelligence have taken over the specialness of human beings' ability to cognate. Human beings will never own that space. They probably haven't owned it for the last 50 years, but now it has. But we are in the era of virtues and the era of divinely infused virtues, the point that you were making. We were able to reassert our humanity. So in my tradition, the core virtues are rahmah, which is God's mercy, maghfirah, which is forgiveness, and love, and what I also call hilm, or the virtue of judiciousness, the cultivation of it. It is in the space of virtues that we can retain our humanity. So we've got to cultivate it. If we don't, then we are going to move headlong into singularity. This is why suddenly ethics and virtues become so palpably important. And that is the space which religious people must occupy. They must occupy that space.
I just want to say tomorrow night, 5 o'clock, then we will continue that conversation. Also here. So, last comment or question, and then we will wrap it up.
Thanks.
There's some refreshments there, and then we can continue the conversation.
Thank you.
But this publication so.
My name is Simon Becker. I'm a former sociologist, so I think it's a sociologist's question I'm going to be asking. I'm certainly going to buy the book, and I'm certainly going to read the book, and thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you, Simon.
I have a son who studied psychology and law, and the last 10 years, he and his father have been talking about life and about on Earth and beyond Earth. I think I'm an agnostic. He is deeply believer that there is no meaning in life. I mean, his joke, if I may give you his joke is that the best French philosophers, if they speak to you for 5 minutes and you understand nothing, they have made their point.
No.
In other words, there is a loss of, and I don't think I ever had that when I was his age.
Right.
I have friends in Canada, Britain, France, and Australia to whom I speak every week, trying to find out, and their grandchildren all have, to refer to the previous speaker, have all sorts of difficulties regarding the loss of meaning of who they are.
And a lot of it in those countries has got to do with generative AI and the consequences of telephones rather than face-to-face, which we all know about. And then thirdly, I've had a number, as I think you know, I've had a number of doctoral students, about 12 to 15 in the last 15 years, and a number have come from Africa, from Cameroon, from Gabon, from DRC, from Angola and so on. And the younger ones, who I got to know very well when they were here, also have this, we are going to do what we need to do in terms of the institutions and the structures, but what it's all about, even though that most of them have got religious backgrounds, both Christian and Muslim, what it's all about we don't know. So, I mean, my question is a sociological question, not about what should be done, but in how far is, let's call it the alienation or the anomie or the loss of meaning of the youth, both in the developed world and in Africa. How broad-based is this? And do you think it is in fact expanding rather than being able to contract? Because it really seems to me, as an old person, that there is more of a loss of meaning in what it's all about.
Right.
Among the youth and among the intelligent and the trained youth than there certainly was when I was a student.
Sure. So I'm trying to figure out how to answer your question sociologically with examples from my religious community. So the answer in general terms is that's correct. In general terms, that is the pattern that's going on, right? It's the idea that you don't anchor your behavior in something more meaningful outside of yourself, so that your individuation is all about your own localized, your own bodily positioning. That's all that I have. And the appendage of the machine is about the curation of that body as an individual within the digital space, social media space. So there's no politics to it, there's no meaning to it beyond that, other than self-curation, curation. That is the generalized sense. I agree with you 100%. In my community, the question is yes. So if that's the case, but what do they do with that? Whether it has meaning or not. And I found instances sociologically of highly creative use of that self-curation within religious discourse, and have written a couple of pieces about it, right? So let me just make you this example by way of conclusion. The food is waiting for us, but we are having that coffee later on, Simon, organized by Muhammad. That is that we in the religious tradition in Islam, we have something called Salatul Layl. Making salah, making prayers deep into the night. The deeper the better. 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. Now, I've never done that in my entire life. I've never fulfilled the obligation. It's a voluntary thing of making prayers deep into the night. I'm making it for 3 hours. We now have a tradition, youth-led, social media-led, utilization of instruments and discourses and so on, in religious and non-religious spaces, where young people, during the month of Ramadan, where you're very tired, from 11 o'clock until 5 o'clock, every night of the last 10 nights, are inside of those mosques praying, physically praying. Mosques are packed with young people under 30 for the last 10 years of the night, continuously. Never seen this in my life. And part of that is social media generated. It is part of the symbolization that attaches itself to the holiness of the month. That is kind of the instrumentalization there. And it is about circulating of food. There's lots of nice food in the middle of the night. You make a prayer for half an hour, then you break for another half, you eat yourself to what's your name, and then you come back in and you pray another half an hour, and so on and so forth. And it's a kind of a night socialization of the night. And I'm trying to say to them, I'm trying as a now older, a middle-aged person, trying to fulfill the compulsory prayers. What about these night prayers? So it has activated a different kind of consciousness of self. So the question is, what is it connected to then? That remains an open question. And I think in every community, I'm trying to make sense of the folk singing in the Christian communities. Is it quirky? It's also a phenomenon that speaks to the moment about social media and and so on and so forth, right? And it's very viral, right? So what I'm suggesting to you is yes, and maybe sociologically no. Maybe there's something else going on.
All right, colleagues, join me as we put our hands together and thank Professor Fataar.
Thank you very much for
Stimulating this kind of engagement,